All right, we're continuing with chapters 23 and 24, and we're going to be looking at Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and the election of 1960. So Truman, of course, we don't really say this, but I guess I probably should, comes into the presidency upon the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So he completes one term, and then he comes up for re-election. I'm trying to find the date on that one. I think it's 1948. He comes back, and that's the first time he actually stands for election. But anyway, so when he comes in, there's a great deal of pressure, and really, Johnson feels this when he comes in after Kennedy, of honoring the prior president who had died. And so Truman creates his domestic plan, which he calls the Fair Deal, which is very close in comparison to the New Deal. But the problem is that he's dealing with a coalition of conservatism within Congress that he's got to have their support in order to get things passed. So in September of 1945, he rolls out this 21-point plan of domestic legislation called the Fair Deal. And I have a handout that I will post, which goes through the whole 21 points. Suffice it to say, I'm not going to ask you individual or questions about individual policies or any of the domestic legislation about that. But some of the most important aspects are the repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act. He's putting money towards education. He actually calls for universal health insurance. This is a big deal because this is in 1945. And he also calls for the continuation of the Fair Employment Practices Commission. So he's trying to blend these kind of elements of the New Deal in with a much more realistic domestic legislation in the face of kind of growing conservatism. A lot of what Truman presents in his 21-point plan doesn't ever happen. And we'll talk a little bit about why. Anyway, let's continue. One of the things that he does do is he establishes a committee on civil rights. And he does this in 1946 through Executive Order 9808. And he charges this committee with investigating the status of civil rights in the country and to propose measures that would strengthen and protect them. And the report that the commission or committee comes out with is called To Secure These Rights. And among the many things that they present, they recommend a Civil Rights Commission and a joint congressional committee on civil rights, and the creation of a civil rights division within the Justice Department. By this time, J. Edgar Hoover is in the FBI, and J. Edgar Hoover would rather die than see a civil rights division within the FBI. So there really a chance to have something like that would be within the Justice Department. Other recommendations of the committee are bans on poll taxes, federal protections against lynching. They're not actually calling for a lynching law, but they are calling for protections against racial violence. And they call for, of course, permanent fair employment commissions or practices commission. What comes out of this are two major executive orders. 9980 calls for the desegregation of the federal workforce, which had begun under Woodrow Wilson in the 1920s, or actually 19-teens. And then 9981, which is the desegregation of the military. So this is truly a New Deal type move for Truman. But it also has with it some costs, and we'll talk about those in a second. One of the big critics of the Cold War is Walter Lippmann, and he's a journalist and probably one of the most important journalists of the time. And he calls into question this idea of focusing foreign policy around the ideological crusade. And this is talking about NSC 68, which basically puts, America on the side of the good and Soviet Union on the side of the bad. His practical concerns are that the country is going to need to recruit and subsidize, quote, array of satellites, clients, dependents, and puppets. Keep in mind, remember when Roosevelt had the good neighbor policy, America moved from an interventionist state into respecting the government and policies of other countries. Well, during the Cold War, it's impossible for America to do that because what happens when a group of, a country votes in a communist leader? The United States is not going to sit there and let that go. But one of the things that I think that is interesting that Lippmann argues is that Americans have to be almost omnicompetent in order to understand the complex world around them, that the world has suddenly become so complex that they need a quote-unquote guiding class that would help them understand what's happening. And he begins to draw criticism of who this guiding class would be, because he believes the intellectuals are undermining democracy. And this is a very non-New Deal thing to say, because the intellectuals, of course, were within the New Deal. And Truman is very much still involved within those New Deal programs and that kind of the coalition that FDR had. Truman is still kind of hanging on to. So it's interesting that he would say this, because there is this kind of distrust of academics and I don't want to say intellectual elite, but the intellectual elite, because they're leading us into further into the Cold War, where there's kind of this distrust of people, if that makes sense. I mean, think about it. The CIA is listening in on American citizens within the United States to determine if they're communist or not. These are things that many Americans find, horrifying, and Lippmann's probably one of them. So in the midterm election of 1946, the Republicans resurge, and they take over Congress. Southern Democrats and Republicans begin to form a coalition against Truman and the Fair Deal. And so this is where Truman begins to lose the ability to get anything passed. And largely what the Southern Democrats are upset about is the fact that Truman has desegregated the military, desegregated the federal workforce, and also made civil rights kind of a big topic. So his own party is basically coming after him. And so this is a kind of Achilles heel that he will have to deal with through the rest of his time in office. Organized labor attempts to move into the South with really bad results. The South is able to keep unions out. And so even though, and really what organized labor is trying to do is they're trying to make up for the fact that they're in this kind of negative public relations view of unions, that they're seen as communist. And so by moving into the South, they're hoping that they might be able to drum up more membership numbers. It really doesn't happen. And following World War II, you have this drop in wages, which of course ends up launching one of the largest strike waves in American history. And so you have the passage in 1947 of the Taft-Hartley Act, which basically reverses a lot of the union gains that had been made during the New Deal. The president could suspend strikes by ordering an 80-day cooling off period. It banned sympathy strikes and secondary boycotts aimed at businesses who did business with the employer. So if you're, working for GE and GE gets their metal from American Aluminum Company, you can't have another strike against American Aluminum Company or sponsor another strike because you're already in a strike with GE, that sort of thing. It outlawed the closed shop. So now we're going back to the open shop, and I think I mentioned that before. Authorized states to pass right to work laws, which means that there aren't any restrictions, that people are able to work wherever they want to. In other words, it's an open system. And it outlaws, and largely it outlaws compulsory union membership. So you can't force people to join a union. In 1955, as a result of all of this kind of negativity that's floating around, the AFL and the CIO merged into one organization. And so labor and management in the major industries come up with what they call the social contract. And this was a kind of compromise between labor and management in leading industries. Management would provide decisions on capital investment, plant locations, and output. Employers agreed to stop trying to limit unions, grant wage increases and fringe benefits, including health insurance, paid time off, and pension plans. So this is an agreement between not just the companies, the upper management, but also the employers, the people who are hiring these workers, also have to have a part in this contract. Okay. So it's really kind of a compromise between labor and management in order to stop strikes from continually happening. In 1948, Harry Truman gets reelected, and it was not supposed to happen. In fact, there's a picture of Harry Truman holding a newspaper that says Dewey wins or something like that. Most people in America were very surprised when Harry Truman won. But what's interesting about the election is that a portion of the party, or the Democratic Party, splits. So you have the progressives, and then you also have those who form the States' Rights Democratic Party under Strom Thurmond. And essentially what the States' Rights Party was trying to do was get the election thrown into the House of Representatives, which according to the Constitution, if you didn't have a solid majority, then it would get thrown into the House, and they were hoping that at that point they would be able to win. They opposed the civil rights efforts of Truman, essentially the things that I had mentioned before. The progressives are a little bit stranger. They're calling for a new relationship with the Soviet Union, and they're opposed to Truman's foreign policy, the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan, essentially containment. And they feel like if they can redraw this relationship with the Soviet Union based on economic cooperation, it'll be a much better world. They also call for the international control of nuclear weapons, strong regulation of business, the end of discrimination of women and African Americans. They call for minimum wage, and they call for the end of the House Un-American Activities Committee. So they view it as a violation of rights, civil rights. So interesting. Anyway, skipping right along to the election of 1952. Truman kind of gets a raw deal. He comes in after FDR. FDR had been in the presidency for, I think, 4 terms. And so Truman comes into the tail end of all of that, and he really doesn't have, or isn't able to really make a big mark. He makes a larger mark from the standpoint of foreign policy than anything else. In the election of 52, you have Adlai Stevenson running against Dwight Eisenhower, and Richard Nixon is the vice presidential candidate under Eisenhower. Nixon is brought up, or there's charges lodged against Nixon about him taking bribes. And so these rumors about Nixon really seem to kind of get blown out of proportion. And so Nixon decides he's going to take matters into his own hands, and he creates this kind of infomercial, you might want to call it, where a film crew comes into his home, and he talks about how American he is and how he's very opposed to communism. Checkers is the name of his dog, and he makes a point to introduce Checkers into the camera, but he makes the comment that Checkers is the only gift that he has ever received from anyone outside of, his family and that sort of thing. So, I haven't taken any bribes, but I did take a dog. And so it's kind of trying to make light of the situation. But what is amazing is it actually works. And Nixon's popularity soars after the Checkers speech. And so at one point, Eisenhower was toying with the idea of jettisoning Nixon. But then after the Checkers speech, he's almost obligated to keep him on the ticket. When Eisenhower gets elected, his brand of domestic policy is called modern republicanism. It's domestic conservatism or progressive moderate. He refuses to do away with Social Security. He refuses to do away with labor laws and unemployment insurance. These are all things that were New Deal programs that many Republicans and conservatives feel should be done away with. And we still are talking about some of this stuff. He actually expands some New Deal programs, creating kind of a mixed economy with some government regulation. So rather than dumping government regulation, he keeps it in some instances. So many of the conservatives, or the new conservatives that are coming up, and Richard Nixon would certainly be one of these, doesn't view Eisenhower as a true conservative. One of the things he does do is he passes or gets passed the National Defense Education Act, which was a direct federal funding to higher education, basically in order to fund scientific programs to compete with the Soviets. This is the first time we ever see direct funding of higher education. So this is considered kind of the golden age of America, this period between 1950 and 1973. You have economic expansion, stable prices, low unemployment, living standards are rising. People are better than their previous generations, and so that's really how they compare themselves. What's interesting is average real wages of manufacturing workers doubles, and wages rose higher for low-income Americans than for high-income Americans. So everybody is feeling the economic success that America is going through. We're going to take a couple of looks at a look at a couple of different charts. This is college graduate wage premium and high school graduate wage premium. And so you see in the 1950s that college graduates earn a much better premium, and that begins to take place. And so this is also falls in line with the GI Bill. And so you have a lot more people going to college. Colleges expand. You have a larger number of colleges in 1950 thanks to the GI Bill than they had prior to World War II. Vehicle ownership per capita goes up, and also it's obviously going to go up for licensed drivers. But it's interesting to see this kind of uplift in terms of vehicle ownership, because vehicles we tend to think of as um, necessities, but really they are considered luxury items. Home ownership goes up as well, which is always good to see because that means the economy is doing well. But across the board, so both white and African Americans are experiencing this growth in home ownership. And when you look at the percentages of urban suburban growth areas between 1920 and 1970, you can see beginning in the 1950s, really 40s and 1950s, suburbia begins to really take off. And so, and so suburban life is kind of one of these byproducts of this golden age of America. So what's driving people to the suburbs? Well, in the suburbs, you can have zoning restrictions, which would provide a much more planned out community, where you wouldn't have just stores next to homes and that sort of thing. Zoning allows for a lot more organization in terms of planning, but it also allows for discrimination to take place. And so redlining, which was taking low income areas and banks refusing to lend to people within the low income areas, that's what redlining is. Hyper segregation, white flight being that they're leaving their urban core to the suburbs, and cheaper housing costs all drive people literally from the cities into the suburbs. And essentially what's happening to the urban core of America, it's becoming abandoned. Levittown is one of the first suburban living communities in the United States. And they have 7 that are in the U.S. and Puerto Rico. And really what they are prefabricated homes. And there's a picture here at the bottom from The Guardian. They're mostly built for returning soldiers from World War II, but William and Alfred Levitt are the founders of this. And so they work with the Veterans Administration and the Federal Housing Administration to guarantee that veterans are going to get qualified for inexpensive rates. And so why rent when you can buy? And this is part of the American dream. One of these prefabricated houses could be built in a day, and it includes a white picket fence, green lawn, and modern appliances. Sales in the original Levittown began in March of 1947, and within the first 3 hours, 1,400 homes were sold. So what you start seeing are these prefabricated or pre-planned communities, a lot of what we see around Jacksonville today, becoming much more popular. And it's urban sprawl. The city is beginning to grow outward during this period. The rise of the baby boomers. This is the period when the birth rate skyrockets, and you can see this coming out of 1945. The baby boomers are this generation that comes in after World War II, when you have families that are moving into the suburbs, and this is the American dream of having, 2.5 kids, a dog, a cat, and a picket fence and a station wagon. The things that we see on TV, like Leave It to Beaver, this is what all of that was about. But what's interesting about the baby boomers is they are the largest generation in American history. And so normally you would have a pyramid, and I'm going to use some drawing here to do this. Usually you would have like a little pyramid. And so your oldest individuals in society are at the top and your youngest are at the bottom. What you see here is certainly not that case, that as the baby boomers move through the age demographics, they create a bubble. And so what's beginning to happen now is that a lot of these baby boomers are beginning to retire. And so there's this concern that once they hit retirement age, that this bulge in the population is going to strain the Social Security as well as the healthcare industry of the United States. And we are in that right now, by the way. The baby boomers are beginning to retire. And so it'll be interesting in the next few years to see what happens from that. In the West, we have the rise of what they call centerless cities, that there is no central urban core. This quickly spreads into other areas. If you think about Jacksonville, for example, Jacksonville does have an urban core, but it lacks any sort of development. It's only now that we're beginning to have high rises and apartment complexes and stuff like that downtown. But centerless cities are literally places where in South Florida, we've got a downtown Miami, but how about a downtown Fort Lauderdale or a downtown Hollywood or a downtown, Delray Beach? You don't have a downtown center anymore. And part of this is because land is so available and highways are creating these wide open spaces for development. So, the construction of the interstate system and the highway system allows for people to drive maybe 20 minutes away from work, and they could be in, the country. And you don't have to live in the urban sprawl anymore. Okay, and we also have the rise of consumerism. And this is where we start to see people studying the market, trying to understand buying patterns, trying to understand how to regulate and interact with the marketplace. You have product testing, you have consumers becoming much more informed and reading up on products. Consumer protections, with return policies and product recalls. A great example of this is the Ford Pinto that had the gas tank, the opening for the gas tank in the very back of the car behind the license plate, that if you hit it hard enough, the car would explode. Sales were really good for the car before people began figuring this out, but then once it started happening, sales plummeted, and Ford had to pay out a great deal of money because of this problem. So you have, TVs in the home. Advertising is promoting family time around the TV. The husband comes home from work and sits in his chair while the wife is serving drinks or serving dinner or cleaning the house. This is hilarious. So the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks, really. Yeah. Wives, look this ad over carefully. Circle the items you want for Christmas. Show it to your husband. If he does not go to the store immediately, cry a little, not a lot, just a little. He'll go. Husbands, look this ad over carefully. Pick out what your wife wants. Go buy it before she starts to cry. Great. But there's obviously a male-dominated advertising scheme here. That there are certain gender roles that are being reinforced here. And in post-World War II, you have the men coming back from the war. This is certainly, women are leaving the workplace in order for men to be able to take their jobs back. So it's very specific in terms of what a man does and what a woman does. So urban sprawl, the American highway begins in 1911 with the construction of the Atlantic Highway, which ran up the coast, the Atlantic coast. The Lincoln Highway and Dixie Highways follow right behind. You have the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1921. And so you start having the growth of highways. And it's really not until the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act is passed under Eisenhower that you start to have real efforts towards building these highways. So the Interstate and Defense Highway Act authorized $25 billion for the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highway system over a 10-year period. And it's considered the largest public works project in American history up until that point. Some of the initial funds were diverted from the defense funds, and most Air Force bases have a direct link to the system. So it's not, I think, the rumor is that, the interstates were built so that you could land an airplane on them, which is crap. That's not true. But they were built in order to help move troops from one place to another relatively quickly. The money was handled in the Highway Trust Fund that paid 80% of the highway construction costs. That meant 90% of the money was paid for by the federal government. 10% was paid by the state. This is a deal that no state would turn down. And that's the point. They wanted states to be able to afford to do this so that you would have a massive system taking over. And the federal portion was funded mostly through taxes on gasoline and diesel fuel. So what this does is it launches a wave of tourism. And tourism had been happening even during World War II. You have a great deal of tourism going on, but of course during the war, rationing meant that a lot of people didn't go very far from home. But places like Florida certainly play into this. You have the motor court, where you literally are in your car, you drive up to the front of your the front of your hotel room, and you just go right in. That was seen as kind of like the end-all be-all for tourism. Places like Silver Springs become meccas for tourism. So even African Americans began to travel as well, and so you had African American only places to visit, and you would have hotels that were specifically geared towards African Americans. And so there is a postman in New York City, Mr. Green, who creates the first Green Book. And basically what this was a listing of hotels, restaurants, and tourist attractions that were friendly for African Americans. And this would get you through the segregated South. And I mean, keep in mind, even though the South is, it was segregated at the time, there were portions of the Midwest where there were sundown towns where African Americans did not want to be after sundown. There was certainly good use for, or good reasons to have the Green Book. But families for generations used that in order to avoid getting into any kind of racial problems. In terms of housing, within the cities, public housing begins to develop, and you have this practice called urban renewal. And urban renewal in the post-World War II society was a way for neighborhoods that were run down, old, and falling apart to just be wiped out, and you could build brand new high-rise buildings. Typically in large cities, because most of these were in the urban core, there were housing projects that were built by the federal government. But so urban renewal, I don't know if I have a picture of this or not. Yes, I do. Okay. So here's an example. I think this is in New York City, where they literally leveled blocks and blocks of old neighborhoods and then built these large housing projects which was supposed to be a way to reinvigorate property values and to encourage new businesses to move into the area. It works to a certain extent, but in another, it's much more detrimental. Because one of the things that happens is that people who were living in these areas that are bulldozed don't get a fair value for their home, and then they're unable to buy into the new building where they would be living. So most of the time you have people who are forced out of their homes, and it's almost like a forced migration. They're forced to move into another area of town, which will eventually also become run down in low income. It's a theory that would almost make sense, but in practice, it's much more detrimental. And I don't know if I talk about it or not. Yes, I do. La Villa and Sugar Hill are two examples of this. You have two thriving African American neighborhoods within Jacksonville in the downtown urban core. And the white leadership comes in and says, okay, well, we're going to build an interstate system, so we have to build it through a neighborhood. We're going to have to destroy a neighborhood. Well, we'll destroy La Villa and Sugar Hill because they're run down. This will bring in new businesses. It's an urban renewal project. And so they literally go in and mow down blocks and blocks of old homes. And many of the African Americans living in these neighborhoods are forced out because they can't afford the new buildings that are being built in the place of where their homes used to be. But if you look at it from a historical perspective as well, you're literally wiping away about 200 years of history. La Villa and Sugar Hill was the wealthy African American neighborhood in Jacksonville, and La Villa was probably one of the most culturally important areas of the United States. You had musicians like Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong that came to La Villa and played in the bars and restaurants here. And so these pictures show you kind of the older section. The picture on the upper right are the shotgun houses that are now fenced in and abandoned. But the shotgun houses were very common during the early 1900s, late 1800s. You've got, and I wish I could remember the name of the hotel and the bar, but the bottom and the middle is it's there today, but this is where Louis Armstrong, when he came to Jacksonville, actually stayed, was in the upper floor of this picture on the right. That had a big balcony out front, and then underneath there were shops and there were restaurants and bars where musicians would play. The picture on the left is the home of Abraham Lincoln Lewis, who was considered one of the wealthiest African Americans in Florida. I think he might have been the wealthiest African American in Florida. Very wealthy, but his home was in Sugar Hill. So when we start talking about this concept of free enterprise, this is something that gets latched onto by conservatives. Truman amends the 4 freedoms to 3: freedom of worship, freedom of speech, and freedom of enterprise. And so there is this idea that this is the American way of life, that we have a marriage of democratic values and economic prosperity, and that is how you define free enterprise. Libertarians consider freedom being defined by individual autonomy, limited government, and unregulated capitalism. So small government, lots of individual rights, and a free market where capitalism is not regulated. Milton Friedman, in his book Capitalism and Freedom from 1962, says that a free market is necessary foundation for individual liberty. And he calls for the turning over of government functions to private sectors, the repeal of the minimum wage, the repeal of the graduated income tax, and the repeal of Social Security. This is largely where a lot of the neoconservatism begins, and you will recognize a lot of the beliefs of neoconservatives, because a lot of this is now what's coming out of the Republican Party at this point in time. People's capitalism had a twofold meaning. Free enterprise came to mean several large corporations producing a wide variety of goods, so you would have the freedom to choose. And Americans also were able to invest into the stock market. And so this is the first real push since the Great Depression when Americans are encouraged to start investing more into the stock market. So neoconservatism. Richard Weaver in Ideas Have Consequences in 48 talks about the West is suffering from moral decay and it needs to return to a civilization based on Christian values and notions of good and evil. But before that society can sustain itself, it needs to have a strong sense of tradition, a strong sense of community, and a strong sense of moral commitment. And most neoconservatives find that moral commitment within Christianity. And so they view big government as the enemy, but they also view government as the only entity able to regulate personal behavior. And so if you bring Christianity and Christian morality into government, you are able to effectively create a true American society that's morally correct and that has a sense of long-standing traditions. This is an ideology that's very much alive today. George W. Bush was a neoconservative. Trump, I believe, is, when in certain circumstances, dictating a neoconservative point of view as well. But a lot of what's coming out of the Republican Party today centers around neoconservatism. One of the big things about neoconservatism is that the free world needs to arm itself morally as well as militarily. So here is where the push for military and military spending comes in, that we need to be able to protect ourselves both from the moral standpoint, but also from foreign invasion and attacks. So Cold War tensions at home. Certainly the rise of fallout shelters. These are quite humorous. I don't know what happens once you get into the fallout shelter, and what happens when you run out of food. I don't know, but anyway, I guess they didn't think that far ahead. But you would have drills in schools for duck and cover. The kids would learn to duck and cover under the desk. I think in the face of a nuclear warhead, I don't think it would really matter because he would be vaporized, but hey, whatever. My favorite is this picture at the bottom right. The cutaway shows the approach to the underground sanctuary via the swimming pool. Hayes figures that any radioactive contamination on a person's body would be washed off while swimming. Hate to tell you, but that's not true. Go figure. So America detonates its first hydrogen bomb, or detonates the hydrogen bomb in 1952. Soviet Union follows suit in 1953. The idea of massive retaliation, that any attack by the Soviet Union would precipitate a retaliatory strike by the United States with nuclear weapons. The result is that everybody would die. So they call this brinkmanship, bringing the world to the brink of destruction. And the idea of mutually assured destruction, the idea that no matter who attacks first, we're all going to die if all we're using is nuclear weapons. And so the result is that traditional military gets budget cuts and the size of the armed forces drop, but your spending goes up in terms of nuclear warheads and nuclear weapons. 1958, you have a halt to testing of nuclear weapons, and it lasts until about 1961. What happens in 1960 is the spirit of cooperation ends with the U-2 spy plane incident. And there is supposed to be a summit between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union at this point cancels that summit. Eisenhower refuses to apologize, and so we're kind of back to where we began. It's important to note that during the period following World War II, we have massive decolonization. And a lot of the European powers have fought 2 world wars and do not have enough money and resources to be able to maintain colonies in Africa and in Asia. And so a lot of these colonies begin to go independent. And so you have the emergence of what we call the Third World. And many of these countries in the Third World are former colonies. And in 1955, you have the Bandung Conference, which was called by India and a number of Third World countries in order to create what they call the non-aligned movement. And what this is basically encouraging a lot of these Third World countries to do is to play the United States and the Soviet Union off of each other. And that you can, if you go to the Soviet Union and you say, well, the United States is offering us, 20 fighter planes, what are you going to give us? And of course, the Soviet Union will come back and say, well, we'll give you 50. And so the idea is the non-aligned movement is focused on their own agenda and not the agenda of the Soviet Union or the United States. The Cold War in the Third World, 1956, Israel, France, and Britain invaded Egypt after the country nationalized the Suez Canal. Eisenhower forces them to pull out, and he issues his own doctrine, which is basically an expansion of the Truman Doctrine. Just that America's power and influence in the Arab world is going to be increased, and that they will defend countries threatened by communism or Arab nationalism. So Eisenhower is getting behind this idea that, if we have disruptions in certain parts of the world, again, the domino theory and containment, foreign policy need to follow suit. CIA operations, I bring this up because there are a great deal of them, and I'm going to show you a list in about a second, and you do not have to memorize any of this. The CIA is everywhere, and what they're doing is they're putting into covert action, a lot of what containment theory and the domino theory are suggesting. So you get rid of the leftist organizations or the people who are favoring the communists, and you reinforce democratic governments. So, election in 1960, we have a young man, John F. Kennedy, who is running against Richard Milhouse Nixon, and some dude named Byrd, I don't know who it is. Anyway, of course, Kennedy ends up winning, but you can see Nixon does a pretty good job. One of the big things that comes out of the campaign of 1960 is that television plays a much bigger role within the presidential campaigns than it has in previous years. And so there's a debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon in which Nixon looks like he's tired and worn out because of the campaigning. And then you've got this young, fresh John F. Kennedy who's there. And of course, Nixon loses the election, but he's going to come back, don't worry. But anyway, Kennedy faces a great deal of obstacles, namely his religion, because he's Catholic. And so there's a great deal of concern about having a Catholic coming into the White House. So in his farewell address, Eisenhower, this is January 17, 1961, was very deliberate about the message that he sends. And he warns the American people about the continuing growth of what he calls the military industrial complex. And what he's saying basically is that there are companies that are partnered with our military that are encouraging the financing of military arms and material. And this isn't good for America because it means that we are constantly under the threat of nuclear war and of potential growing hysteria around communism. And so he saw this as a big concern walking out of the White House and really walking out of public life because he had been in public life for so long. But he wanted Americans to know that of this concern, that he warned that the establishment should never endanger our liberties or democratic processes. And what he meant by that is that the more we become entrenched in this kind of arms race with the Soviet Union, the more likely we are to infringe upon our individual liberties and potentially damage our democracy permanently. His granddaughter wrote of the speech. The speech would become a solemn moment in a decidedly unsolemn time, offering sober warnings for a nation giddy with newfound prosperity, infatuated with youth and glamour, and aiming increasingly for the easy life. Eisenhower is closing out on the golden age of America, and he recognizes that and he sees that. Kennedy's emergence into the White House is almost like a new start for America, and the idea that everything is new again. And of course, this is the beginning of the 1960s and the counterculture movement, and we'll talk more about all of that as well. But it's a very decidedly sober reminder from Eisenhower and a warning to us about getting too entrenched in this kind of military mentality and way of thinking.